Welcome to Mac and Blue, the cutting-edge podcast for the nation's builders, merging the realms of construction with exciting advancements in technology. Join us on a thrilling journey where we delve into the dynamic world of blockchain, AI, the metaverse, virtual and augmented reality, and their transformative impact on the industry. Our engaging discussions span a wide spectrum, covering not only construction, economic development, supply chain, and market segments, but also exploring the vibrant tapestry of diversity within the construction landscape. We shed light on the intersection of local politics and its profound influence on the construction sector, while championing the remarkable contributions of women and minorities in construction. For all things Mac and Blue, head to www.macandblue.com, and don't forget to subscribe on YouTube. I'm your host, JJ Levinsky. Now let's get into it. Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Mac and Blue. I'm your host, JJ Levinsky, CEO and co-founder of Blue Wave. Today, I'm very fortunate to have national guests, John Smolen and Steve Park from Ballard Spahr. For those of you that don't know, Ballard Spahr is a national, or are you guys international or just national? National law firm. I actually have worked with some people in your office here on different matters, but I was fortunate enough to find John and Steve were featured in a national article. I would say it was like, what, 3-4 months ago. I read it and was kind of moved by it, and I said, hey, let me contact these two guys out east, see if they'd be humble enough to get on the Mac and Blue podcast, and here we are finally. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining, and appreciate you being here today.
Happy to be here, JJ. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks for saying that something that featured John and Steve was moving. Steve, I think that's the first one for the both of us, but
yeah. Well,
I'll let you be moved.
Hey, I'm a construction geek and a nerd, so it's better than soft porn, right? Engineering's better than that, right?
That's good for the algorithm.
Yeah, humility is our calling card, so we're ready to go.
So, hey, you guys kind of know how this works. Everyone wants to know the human side of you guys before we get into all the geeky stuff we're going to talk about with P3. So, I don't care who goes first. John, maybe I'll start with you. Are you based, Steve, you're based in Philly, right? And John, you're based in what, Baltimore?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you would, John, a little bit of background. It's kind of cool. You're a Naval Academy guy. So just where'd you grow up and how the hell did you get into being an attorney? I mean, come on. It's not the most popular thing.
Well, I'll start with the end. I thought attorneys would have normal working hours. And so when I was in the Navy, my thought was that I needed to find a job that was more of a 9-to-5. And I think the joke is on me. I may have had a 9-to-5 job on the ship, not compared to being a lawyer, but so I grew up in Kansas City, and no water in Kansas City. Decided after watching Top Gun, like everyone else in Generation X, that I was going to go into the Navy and I was going to go to flight school, and I did, and I was a helicopter pilot for almost 10 years and got a chance to go after my flying time in the Navy. When I was going to start flying a desk, they gave me an opportunity to teach at Virginia Tech. I did that, and that got me interested in academics and followed my nose into law school. To your direct question about how you get into P3s, the short version is that every lawyer, in one way, shape, or form, finds their way into a practice area a little bit by choice and a lot more by chance. And so I was recruited into a group that was working on some renewable energy stuff, which got me interested in developing projects. And then I found out that P3 projects were very complicated, very big, very political, very important, and got the opportunity to do that at another firm, and then was competing against Steve and losing a few times more than I was winning. So we decided to join forces, and I think we're doing pretty good. So there's my story.
Could we take, I probably didn't do a good enough job for the audience. We should take just the time out before we go to Steve's resume. What is P3? Some people might not know what it really even means. So let's define P3.
You want to go, shipmate? Steve?
Sure. Why don't I start that, and then John, you can fill in. I mean, at the broad strokes, when we refer to P3, we refer to public-private partnerships. And a lot of people call a lot of different things P3. So, technically my garbage is picked up not by my township that I live in. Is that a P3? I guess you can make the argument that it is, but we're not talking about that. We mostly refer to very large scale or somewhat medium scale sometimes infrastructure projects. Most of the time, we're talking about the delivery of those projects. So you want to build a new highway or a tunnel, new student housing on campus, a new whatever it might be, energy system or utility system on campus. It's that, some of the time we're talking about monetizations, which are more, hey, I have this asset that I may be able to monetize, or an uglier word is privatize, but we try to use monetize because it sounds cooler. That's a kind of a different shade of P3, which we also definitely participate in. And then we also kind of delve into lots of other kind of offshoots of P3, I will say, even within P3, and I want to keep it pretty high level. There are different ways to deliver different projects, but then we have a pretty burgeoning alternative delivery part of our practice, which maybe is a good segue for John to lead into.
Do you mind, Steve, before we get into that, do you mind giving a little bit of your background so the audience can relate to you, like how you got into being a lawyer in Ballard Spahr, and then how the P3 thing fell into your lap as well?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, I grew up in New York City. I kind of bounced around before I decided to go to law school. When I went to law school, here, again, based on the Philly area. I went to law school here in the Philly area and kind of decided to stick around here. And one of the things that Ballard does very well back then, and still does now, is public finance. And so I was nominally kind of grew up as a public finance bond lawyer. And then one of the really kind of first big deals we did when I was at the firm, obviously the firm's been around way before John or I ever got there. One of the first big deals that I got, involved in was a P3 deal. And there wasn't a P3 group at the time. So they kind of thought, well, maybe the public finance guy should lead that project since it's kind of nominally government, nominally finance. And so kind of just started my career doing it, kind of maybe slightly by accident. Like John said, sometimes you choose, sometimes you get picked, right? And so it is what it is. But it's been great, and it's interesting. The projects are all very different. They're high profile. They're very complicated, and they kind of bring in lots of different people with lots of different expertise. And so you learn a lot about a lot of different things, and it's been a great ride thus far. I've only ever spent my career here at Ballard.
Okay. If you guys don't mind, again, just so the audience has context as far as where we get into we'll get into more of the granular discussion. What's the history of P3 and what was the case law? Like, was there in 1974, this happened that precipitated the whole P3 movement? Do either one of you have some stories or context nationally of where it started and how that kind of transformed?
Yeah, Steve, I'll kick it off. I wish it was as exciting as in 1974. People got together with their quill pens and whatnot. What happened was in England, there was a need to develop a lot of public infrastructure kind of all at once. There had been considerable neglect and political posturing that had resulted in a lot of stuff just not sticking around. And unlike America, in England, there are a lot of things that are government owned. So, schools, in many cases, hospitals. So they came up with an idea where there's only so much money that the English could raise, the Parliament could raise at a given time, but they needed to get that infrastructure in place. And so they came up with an opportunity for the private sector to not only build out the stuff they were looking for, but actually have an investment in the infrastructure they were building. They called it PFI, which I think stands for Private Finance Initiative, although I could be wrong on that. Long story short, the investment was not a typical real estate type investment. It was the idea that in as much as this was a public service that was residing in this infrastructure, it's a road, it's a tunnel, it's a hospital, if the infrastructure was able to perform as it was intended to do, which is a strange conception, then the investors would get a return on the investment. So legal communities are at once very big and very small. This PFI initiative, they kind of worked out the kinks in England, and in many cases things worked spectacularly well. In other instances, they were absolute disasters. But the Americans cherry-picked these in the context of some toll roads.
Okay.
first, and the idea was that the tolls could be a source of revenue to build the road, not unlike every other toll type facility. You do it now and you borrow against your future tolls, but now the idea was tolling could be viewed as an investment opportunity for people to put their money in earlier to make up for any shortfalls in public money. The upshot being, not unlike England, you get more infrastructure earlier and it's functioning, and the public interest is that a functioning infrastructure is serving the public purpose. And so long as it's functioning, the private investors who help bring it forward in time get a return on their investment. And that's where the road kind of sprays out. I think Steve's experience that he had with his first project that he was alluding to was probably a good example of what was in the middle of toward the end of the first cycle of American P3s. And then we have been, Steve and I both have been very much involved in the second, and then I think at the beginning of the third wave of them now.
Thank you, John, for that explanation. If I may, again, just for broad time frames, when did we as Americans kind of grasp that? What decade was that we adopted or adapted that methodology?
Mid-90s, Steve?
Yeah, I think it started mid-90s, right? So you had a few projects going through, but it's relatively recent. So there's not a ton of firms that do it. But yeah, mid-90s is when it started. Early 2000s is when it started to get big. And then certainly like late 2000s, early 2010s is when we had a lot of projects. And we still have a lot of projects kind of going right now. So I would say mid-90s is when it started and kind of really started to boom in the early 2000s.
So on the capital side, let me ask some questions, and then maybe we could maybe Steve and John, you can go through one of your projects that you could take us from beginning to end to really give a sense of it. But let me ask you a couple of things that came up in my mind is, on the private side then, much like a debt structure, on a kind of a preferred equity type structure, does the private side get paid back before the public side? Is there preferred equity almost in that situation?
So the private side, so there's almost always real debt, right? So there's typically these projects are financed debt equity. Not always. Sometimes you have kind of like 100% debt deals, but that's very few and far between, and mostly in very specific sectors like student housing. Okay. So most of these projects are debt equity. And again, most of the projects we're talking about a project where we're building something. So we're building a road or building, the delivery is what the benefit to the public is, right? So the benefit to the public is not so much a check, but more the delivery of the thing itself, right? So I need this building built, I need this road built. Here's a way to build it, theoretically quicker, faster, maybe not cheaper, but the delivery of it is the thing itself. And those kind of early, monetization type projects, those were really like, I have an asset and I'm going to effectively monetize, kind of take some money out of that. So there you typically would have some kind of upfront check, but that happens kind of at closing, right? So there's an upfront check, and then, me, the developer, I'm going to take this toll road, and I'm going to figure out how I can make money off the toll roads. And in that scenario, you would have some kind of revenue share probably on the back end with the public sector. But for the kind of new build projects, there's no real public money. If anything, the public's paying for the asset. Right. It's more, but the delivery of the asset itself is how the public benefits from it.
So again, forgive my naivety, Steve, but does it have more of a bond financing structure then than a straight financing structure?
It depends. We've seen all. I would say we've seen all of the kind of different capital markets play. Okay. Depending on if it's eligible for tax-exempt financing, certainly have tax-exempt financing. But we have a project right now that has 6 layers in its capital stack, and so sometimes it can be very complicated, unduly so, probably. And then sometimes you have very, very simple kind of all debt deals.
Thank you for that high-level explanation. Let me go one step further on the risk side, and then maybe we can jump into a case study or an example of either one of you. With the partnership, then, I am curious. I think the audience would be very curious how the indemnity works. Like, does does the private side get a different indemnification then if it's does the public side take a greater risk on the partnership on indemnity?
Well, I mean, I guess I can answer that both ways. Indemnities in particular, they're really isolated to things that are outside of the actual behavior between the partners in the delivery of the project. So
okay.
The indemnities tend to focus on, someone showing up and juggling chainsaws when they're not supposed to in the middle of traffic, and then someone gets hurt, that kind of indemnity. But in terms of, if the asset, like the monetization Steve was talking about, is really shifting a whole lot of risk on the performance of the project to the private sector investor who is incentivized to make things work. So the recovery happens all up front. So the indemnity in a different context is you get paid an indemnification right at the outset. In fact, as a bookmark, that would be a segue into the case study of the P3 that comes to mind from my side, which was a monetization of a toll road in Indiana, which was used then to pay for the building of new infrastructure also in Indiana, which was a successful P3 that I did. So to a certain extent, they got an improved road and a check and a new asset for the amount of money they got for the check. And that's kind of the approach. But I will say, to Steve's other point, they may get an upfront check, but if in certain structures, if they perform, then they get paid. But if the road doesn't perform, if there's some other problems, it's not so much of an indemnity as a lopping off of the cost that you pay to the private sector because the project is not doing what you promised it to do. So that's a complicated. Indemnities usually turn people off. So I'm excited to be on a podcast when we want to talk about indemnities because they're super exciting. Lawyers love to talk about indemnities.
Yeah, well, welcome
to the world, JJ.
Target. Hey, the target rich audience. Come on, I had to have you guys on there. Well, it's the way my brain works. So I try to ask these questions. Like I always trying to think like, how would the audience want, they want to know risk and reward, right? So that's what I think. Why don't we do this? Why don't we jump in? If I don't care which one of you goes first, if you can, in a manageable time frame, talk about one or two case studies, maybe each one of you. And then I think if we do that, maybe we'll come up with some good questions that will come out of that so we can kind of keep going. So Steve, if you want to hit it off.
Yeah, sure. I'll go first. I'll use a managed lanes example because I think that's something that I think people are seeing pop up more across the country. So in Virginia, we've worked on multiple in some places they call them managed lanes, toll lanes, hot lanes, but sometimes you see the regular traffic and then you see just a lane that's tolled on the side, right? So again, sometimes you call them toll lanes, managed lanes. In Virginia, they call them hot lanes. They call them high occupancy toll lanes. And in almost all of those instances, HOV gets to ride for free, right? So if you're HOV, now depending on what HOV 3 typically, but sometimes you have HOV 2, which would be harder. But anyway, so in Virginia, we worked on the development and then extension of multiple hot lanes projects, both on I-95 and on 495, all around the DC suburbs. And if you've ever driven around the DC suburbs, there's a lot of traffic. And so, the Virginia Hot Lanes project has been wildly successful. And they've been able to alleviate lots of traffic. And, so the delivery of it is, I'll just go a little bit deeper into it, is Virginia entered into a contract with an Australian developer here, Transurban, to develop effectively all the lanes with under different contracts. And Transurban runs the risk. So Transurban pays for it through, again, some combination of debt and equity. They design it. They build the lanes. By building the lanes, they effectively have to figure out a way to make what was currently, let's just say, 4 lanes each way, 5 lanes each way, and with at least on 95, the toll lanes are reversible in the middle. So they go up north during the morning towards DC and then south towards Fredericksburg, away from DC in the afternoon. And they're kind of in the middle of the highway on the 495 or the Capital Beltway. They just run, each side has its own beltway. It kind of depends on how the traffic flows and the nature of the highway. But, they have to build the hot lanes, I'm sorry. And then they have to operate them. set the tolls. The tolls are variable. So depending on how heavy traffic is, the tolls will move up and down. So I know that on any given day on I-95, if you want to ride the toll lanes all the way up, it's something like $35. It's pretty expensive. Yeah, no, I know. I think I remember, this is a different project, but on 66, which is also in Virginia, something like, we're not a very long piece of road. It's something like $50 or something like that. But the idea, and so they are, I will say, have been referred to as Lexus lanes or Cadillac lanes, depending on if you like the importer, foreign cars or not, I guess, right? But the idea is that for the people that can afford to ride, I'm sure, good for you, but it does alleviate traffic. And under federal law, those lanes actually have to move at 45 miles an hour. So the reason for the variable toll is because they have to move at 45 miles an hour. They actually have to set the tolls high enough to push people out of the lanes in order to make the highway move at a certain pace. Otherwise, what's the point of paying the $50 if you're not going to be able to actually go anywhere, right? And so now I will say I've been on toll lanes that are not moving 45 miles an hour, so not sure what's up with that, but yeah. So in that, the deal Transurban has to set the tolls again based on the variable nature of the highway, and they take all the risk. They take the risk of the tolls being there to pay for their debt and their equity. And at some point, once they hit their equity rate of return, there's a profit share with the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I don't know anyone that would say that those projects are not hugely successful. Those are hugely successful. Kind of look at this. This is how you do it. Transurban, I'm pretty sure, has made its money and then very well. But, in terms of what the Commonwealth gets out of it, the Commonwealth of Virginia has had a problem. They found a way to alleviate that problem using the private sector. There's a true partnership there. They are in each other's business all the time. They talk. Sometimes they fight. Sometimes there's disagreements. It's like a family, but it's a true partnership. And again, to say it again, it's been very successful and kind of a really bellwether project, I think, all around the country.
There comes a time when dreams become a reality, when you see your vision materialize into a true work of art. And the only way to get there is to choose a general contractor who shares that same vision and knows how to bring it to life. At Blue Wave, we aren't so big that we've forgotten where we've come from. And we aren't so small that we can't care for your projects regardless of their size. When your vision deserves safety, perfection, timeliness, and expertise in order to become a reality, trust Blue Wave to get it done right the first time.
Steve, if I may interrupt you, what success is kind of, I get it, thank you. But to me, it's vague.
Sure.
Can you give me some tangible takeaways of success other than the asset itself, that it's up and operational? What else was successful about it in tangible terms?
It's a good point, right? So, obviously the Commonwealth and Virginia DOT itself can figure out traffic patterns and the way that people move. And, there's all these studies about how much productivity is wasted while people sit in traffic, right? And so the ability to get people out of their cars quicker, the ability to get people from one place to another, that in and of itself generates the wanting to be in a certain area, right? Northern Virginia is already pretty crowded as it is, right? But, there's more and more people coming into Northern Virginia. And so the ability to have traffic not be an impediment, right? But having this as an access point for people to say, okay, well, this is still a good place to invest my business and my time and my house and, where I live, because I know that I can do whatever I need to do, because not just because these hotlines exist, but that's a part of the overall infrastructure outlay in Northern Virginia to allow for some growth. But John, what do you want to chime in here and see?
Well, I mean, what you're getting at, JJ, is actually why, among the other reasons, kind of lawyerly ones about complication and a public service and whatnot. So it's kind of the interesting part of P3. What Steve's talking about, these things that are measurements of success, that actually becomes central in the formation of the public-private partnership and the conceptualization of what this asset is. The historic view of a public asset is somebody somewhere is designing it to last as long as possible, and then they're going to bid it out to someone to build it for the lowest price. And so you have this public asset which reflects the state of the art and the situation at the time it was designed, and with the best possible stuff, presumably, because you're specifying it, and then you deliver it. And in a P3 context, you talk about what a road is supposed to do, not what it's supposed to be, what it's supposed to do. And it's supposed to convey people more quickly from point A to point B and allow for all of these knock-on consequential type effects that Steve is speaking to, which confer certainly public benefits. But you can, and you do, and frankly, folks in our position, shepherding the thinking about these, spend real productive time inventorying all of the things that people want it to do as measurements of success. And so this manifests in the contract, either in terms of how it is that they tune, to Steve's point, like how do you tune the variable tolls? Because maybe speed on that thing is the thing, the federal minimum of 45, maybe we want to shoot for higher, speed is the point. But for like a building, for example, that maybe it's that the walk is shoveled and the electricity only glitches every 15 minutes every 365 days. The trash is taken out. The security system is rock solid. It moves this many people through on the circulation through a courthouse or through a school complex, or it creates modulation in the use of a school space such that these things can be swung and minimize the number of times that kids are in trailers. I mean, you inventory all of those things up front. Those then become part of the measurements and essentially the procurement part, where someone is coming to the table showing how their solution is going to demonstrate the effectiveness of the performance of this asset. And then when you move into the contract, those become commitments. And then the yardsticks, which translating performance into degrees of performance or consequences for performance, becomes the lawyerly part of this. But the transition from thinking of design into construction and thinking of it as the entire life cycle of a public asset and an investment opportunity for someone to say the utilization of this investment of public and private dollars is going to bring about these public goods. And if it doesn't, here are the consequences to the private investor. Here's the consequences to the public owner. It makes it for an interesting contract. There's tropes about how every P3 is unique, and it's true because every situation that has a piece of public infrastructure, be it horizontal or vertical, is trying to solve a particular problem for a particular constituency, trying to do a particular thing at a particular place at a particular time. And the footnote on this I would offer is, because we're thinking about how to do it, some really interesting cross-disciplinary discussions take place where engineer one, for example, might think we need to build this thing with concrete. And then engineer two says, well, that's going to cost this much. Why don't we build it with balsa wood? And then engineer three says, well, maybe there's this new fangled styrofoam, whatever. It lasts for 50 years. And we all think about what the positives and negatives of those particular materials are. And then we think about how it's going to help the building function, not whether or not it's the gold-plated thing or whether or not that's what I learned in engineering class before, which circles me all the way back to the front, which is those infrastructure projects that historically attend our country are the best that we have about what we know at the time we're doing things. And now we have a lot of infrastructure that's built for a world that has gone before us. So, I was in a parking garage the other day watching this pickup truck barely make the clearance because I know it was made in the late 70s and early 80s when people were driving those little gas crisis cars. And so now, if you were to do a parking garage, you'd be thinking about what does the future look in 5, 10, 25 years? Can we use this space for this other thing? Do we need to anticipate electronic charging? Do we need to have a place for AVs to go at night and self-park themselves to charge? And you start conceiving about the function of a building instead of the, as it were, then and there purpose of the building that's going to last forever. It rethinks infrastructure as a policy matter in a way that I find interesting when I'm called to sit at the table and negotiate one side or another.
Good stuff. Can I hit you guys with a ton of questions now?
Yeah.
Okay. So, by the way, thank you, gentlemen, both. It gives a great, I think, and I know, John, I didn't give you a lot. You really didn't get a chance to do a case study, but I think we're going to get into some granular stuff here that'll do it. Is one of the first things that came to my mind is if basically we in the United States have only been doing this for less than 30 years, based on what your statement, John, is. It's one thing to look at it through the eyes of the engineer, contractor, the people on us on the tangible side. How in the hell did your industry, what beta and what case study and what information did you guys and gals have from the legal side, the attorney side? How are you able to keep going forward with all these changes? Like, is it truly just such a unique discipline within what you guys do, that especially going from federal to different states to different, lugs, if you will, local units of government? How do you navigate that? It blows my mind how you're even navigating that.
Well, I invite Steve to jump in on that. Lawyers like Gordian knots. The more complicated it is and the more you're able to sort of attack it, solve it, it becomes a satisfying undertaking. I will say there's a method to it. The method is to distill out all of the constraints and the powers that are given to a particular jurisdiction who wants to undertake these things. And then there's a very big political assessment. And then there's a stakeholder inventory political view that gives rise to this is okay here, this is not okay, which we're contrast with other states and other lugs. I like that, by the way. And then you go through it methodically. The P3 is a delivery philosophy, frankly,
right,
that you can apply to solve problems where the view is that some sort of infrastructure solution is implicit in the problem.
Got it.
So, global warming, climate change, resiliency, there's a lot of words that run around. At some point, somebody somewhere needs to say, we need this to be more resilient. Well, what is the this and what does this being resilient look like? And then those disciplines go in both from an engineering perspective, and then to Steve's point, if you delegate the financing responsibility, the banks and lenders have something to say about that, as do the equity investors. Those conversations that are friction points across the disciplines, for me, make for very interesting conversations with the lodestar of, let's know what we can do, let's see how other people have done it, what is the thing that's most important, let's put some words around that, how does this serve everybody's interests? We come together, you write it down.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Next question. John, you had referenced the start in Europe. I think I'm fairly attuned that there's many countries over in Europe that are still doing this, and I'm not trying to keep score here, but I'm curious. We as the United States, have we adapted to what they're doing over there, different countries, and have we? I'm not trying to keep score here, but have we gone ahead, or are we still behind some of the other countries? Are we learning from each other and advancing this art, if you will, and science?
Well, Steve might have something to say about this too. I will say that I'm going to sidestep your question because we both take a ball, and they play soccer, we play football.
Yeah,
and it's hopelessly different based upon who it is that's employing the effort. There are American strategies, there are Commonwealth country strategies. There are several of those professionals that come over here and bring some of those things, but they bring with them the cultural underpinnings of the approach. And then they run up against, P3s in Texas, P3s in Arizona. You've had some successful P3s, the South Mountain Highway, not my deal, but I know the guy who did it and he's great. Right. And, that deal is reflective of Arizona's sensibilities.
Okay.
So there's no score apart from whether or not it came out successful and there is a road there for you folks going around the South Mountain and going faster. If the answer is yes, then it's a success. I would say the hit or miss projects that have come together and worked well, that it's not really fair to say some of them are successful or not successful based upon where they are. It's more about successful or unsuccessful based upon adherence to the performance requirements and the partnering responsibilities of both people, and then it has to do a little bit with the economy. An example, like when Steve was talking about monetization, it's really great to size up a big toll road as an example, and then you monetize the toll road, you get a big chunk of money, and then 2020 happens and nobody's in a car. That's not a successful P3 or an unsuccessful P3. That's the world happening.
Yeah.
As an example. So
good
Steve,
statement.
You've probably seen a few things.
Yeah, I mean, another thing I'd add is a lot of the P3 players on the developer side are foreign, right? So it's not so much that we're winning or losing, but we're just part of the overall kind of world game. And so that, we have, I would say most of the developers are foreign. And so, some of them are not, right? And so depending on the asset that you're building, you're going to have Spanish companies and French companies and British companies and Canadian companies in. And they certainly will use some of the ideas and concepts that have been developed in their countries, but I think that goes both ways, frankly, right? Because they something happens in the U.S. and that becomes kind of a widely understood way to do it. I'm sure that then they take that back to Australia or Canada and say, hey, what if we do it this way? So it kind of goes both ways. And I agree with John. I don't know that this is a winning or losing or getting ahead or going backwards kind of thing. It's more just kind of learning from each other.
Yeah, and Steve, that was really the cusp of my question and what I wanted to get out of it. It really wasn't that's why I kind of prefaced it, but I didn't want to keep score. I wanted to say the cumulative sum of the advancement of P3 in all that it stands for. I wanted to know if it was, the international vibe had, instead of just being a linear like this, had we actually gone like this a little bit because of that cumulative effect? That was the question.
Yeah. No, I think we have. It's certainly the US P3 market is, and they always refer to it as a US P3 market because it's different. And so the Spanish players or the French guys, when they do a project here, they know it's going to be different. Every state, to your earlier to John's point, every state is different, right? So when they know they can operate in blank state versus the other state, they know that there are certain things that are going to change based on, whatever it is. Sometimes there's constitutional prohibitions on some things, and they just have to get over it, frankly. Or they know that the state's, pretty friendly towards blank, and they know that they can push the envelope in certain things. And so, for sure, I think the US P3 market has certainly kind of solidified into something that they know that they can kind of access, but it all kind of does congeal at some point into kind of common understanding.
On that note, go ahead, John. No, John, you go first.
Footnote on that is that, I don't want to call them fads, but there are trends that are driven by the financial markets, that are driven by the political appetites of different jurisdictions across the world, and then their successes in light of things that are and are not in their control. So part of the P3 delivery is it's a family of exercises between, pre-development work, site type exploration work, all the way up and through design, building, financing, operating, maintaining, and how you put those together and then you apply it to a particular jurisdiction, to a particular asset, becomes, some things prove to be really well done, and then people emulate it. And then another thing happens and people emulate that. So that there are ways that the P3s manifest that people try to emulate the good things and then try to step away from the bad things. And that sometimes the bad things are foreign examples, sometimes they're domestic.
Great. No, good statement. Gentlemen, another question. Have you seen regional success, or like in the evolution of how it's the US P3? Did it start out east and it moved west? I mean, have we seen areas where it's been hugely successful and other areas that it really hasn't been taken hold yet? I just kind of, could you speak to the state of the country when it comes to P3?
So it's really depended, I would say, on whether or not the state legislature allowed for P3, right? So you have to have, so not every state allows for P3s. Now, You could be in a state that doesn't allow for P3, but you're a major, a lug, to your point, to use your term, and you may have home rule, so you can just do it anyway, right? And so some P3s are kind of very real estate-y, right? So you can kind of use your real estate legislation or whatever they let you do to kind of shoehorn a P3 in, and certainly we've seen that happen. But at the big state level, not every state has P3 enabling legislation. Now, I would say, and John, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe like 35 to 40 do probably at this point. So most of the country does. But certainly you've seen some states kind of really take the lead on P3.
Which ones, Steve? Do you have a couple states that are the leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. Some of them are our clients, so I don't want to leave anyone out here. But I'll say, initially there's a lot of Texas, and now there's not so much Texas anymore.
Okay.
Certainly Arizona's done some, because I know that we want to prop up the home team here. But Virginia's done a lot. Florida did a lot in the beginning, and Florida hasn't done some, right? So I would say Virginia, Georgia. My home state of Pennsylvania has done a few. John's home state of Maryland has done a few. So, I would say a lot of them have done a few. Indiana, right? And so to John's earlier point, so you have states. So it's certainly not, and I want to kind of, it's not really geographical, right?
Okay, it's not.
Done a few. California's done a few. So it's not that. It's more.
But is it it geopolitical?
No.
Okay.
Like it's a D or R? No, not at all.
Okay.
Actually,
okay.
Not even close. I mean, we've done deals all kind of in states, and tends very much not to be. And so in that sense, it's been good. It can be in the sense that if it was the last guy's project, then I don't want to do it. Like specifically political, but not like, oh, this is something that only one side of the ledger likes to push forward. If anything, infrastructure tends to be agnostic.
Well, and I asked that specifically because I think that's a stereotype that is out there. I've heard it before, so I think that's why I asked the question. So I think you guys have refuted that. Go ahead, John.
I'll just add in, back to my earlier point about there are different ways to put those spices into the broth to make it taste different. Some states that are historically PAYGO type states find some of the features of P3 that have to do with the regimented importation of some innovation in a procurement context that's fair. Yeah. They roll with that. And then there are some states that have strong views that the long-term payments or the monetizations are going to solve near-term problems. And so they're willing to have some, as it were, debts, long-term commitments to do this. Other states don't like to do that, like they would like to PAYGO, but they do want to grab some of the pieces parts that make P3s good values. So back to the earliest point about what are the objectives and what do you want the infrastructure to do, one of the constraints when everybody, of course, wants everything is here's where your enabling legislation stops you, but here's also where culturally you might have some issues. We can get this, but this is what the cost of it is, as it were, or the risk. We're fond of saying in many instances that where there's lots of opportunities to expand the metaphorical pie, there's some times where it's like, I want more control. Well, more control is going to constrain the things that you're going to be able to get from the P3. And conversely, giving over some control and caring only about outcomes means that there's more opportunity for there to be a blossom or a failure on the part of the importation of these other people's ideas. So this is a dynamic situation. I would say Steve cited all the people who've had successes, and they have moved, I had mentioned before, first, second into kind of the third wave. There are several states that are coming in, and they come from different angles. Some of them come in and say, we want to do buildings, but not civil infrastructure. Some are, we want to do civil, but no buildings. Some of them, like Steve said, start at the municipal level to solve specific problems. Some of them are philosophical points that come from on high, and then they proliferate through any number of devices. I'd say I grew up in the Midwest, as I shared. They are starting, in my mind, to see the facility of some of these different features of the delivery items or the delivery options that are going to portend receptiveness to understanding some, continuing down that road and trying a few more of those letters on on the string if it works. And I think that's really just cultural, which would be the thing. It's not political, it's cultural. Yeah. And I find that interesting for me when Steve and I sort of perched on top of the country. You really get to see, to your point about what the reputations are, you get to see if the reputations for particular regions are accurate or not. And you walk through and you can shape something that meets their sensibilities and their infrastructure needs.
There comes a time when dreams become a reality, when you see your vision materialize into a true work of art. And the only way to get there is to choose a general contractor who shares that same vision and knows how to bring it to life. At Blue Wave, we aren't so big that we've forgotten where we've come from, and we aren't so small that we can't care for your projects regardless of their size. When your vision deserves safety, perfection, timeliness, and expertise in order to become a reality, trust Blue Wave to get it done right the first time.
John, you said something about breaking down vertical to horizontal. I'm curious, are we seeing, I would say, this may be a bad assumption because you know what they say about assuming things, but let me just throw this out there. I'll fall on the sword if I have to. That P3 had probably a much more heavy civil background when it first started, and now would it be fair to say we're going more into vertical? And if it is there any kind of sense of the percentage if you break 100% down as far as civil horizontal versus vertical P3 projects, the development?
My 2 cents is that civil certainly led. That's where it started here in the States because it was more manageable and there was more bang for the proverbial buck. They're bigger projects.
Right.
But I don't think it's more like civil's going down, horizontal, that we call it social infrastructure, is going up. It's more like this is working in this context. Let's try it in these other contexts. So there's still a steady state civil infrastructure deal flow that ebbs and flows based on frankly, the interest rates to a certain extent. Agreed. But there's more jurisdictions that are interested in solving their infrastructure problems by borrowing pieces of successful civil infrastructure approaches and applying them to smaller deals that are horizontal, but perhaps bundling them to scale so they can realize the benefits of those scales. There's a deal here in my backyard in Prince George's County, Maryland, that I think they just finished delivering 5 of the 6 schools in a middle school bundle under a P3 delivery approach. It's old school. If I said horizontal, I meant vertical, pardon me. Yeah. But they're schools. They scaled that, and that drew the infrastructure investors. That drew more opportunities for innovation and, frankly, more opportunities for efficiencies, because instead of letting 6 schools, you let 6 total schools, and you could coordinate the movements, you could coordinate the supply times, you could coordinate the rollouts, you could move crews from school to school. Those are you take the sum total of all of those, and that is borrowing heavily from what worked in civil and applying it into social. And so it's more like they're all growing, and which is great.
Yeah, and I think John's right, and I think if anything, you have a wider array of possible like public sector participants when you go vertical, right? Because municipality, your lugs can do that. I mean, they can certainly do some smaller civil deals, but more likely they're going to look at vertical deals. And you have universities, and you have, using John's example, public schools. I mean, public schools need to get delivered, right? And so it's just a great example of that. And then you also have a larger influx of private side developers, because you have a ton of big contractors in the U.S. that are used to delivering vertical projects, and so they can play in that field. And they can't necessarily play at a $2 billion civil deal, and they're just not going to play there, right? But if my local city or local county wants to deliver some schools, hey, you know what, I can do that, right? And so now you have a wider array of competition on the private side.
Yeah, and you guys both answered the question, but and where I was deriving that from, gentlemen, was as we've seen Wall Street and the large private equity companies have large capital stacks where they want to infuse that into as much more vertical than horizontal. It just seems like a seamless transition to P3 and things of that nature. So it just seemed obvious from some of the areas that I play in. Let me ask you guys another question, and I don't know how to phrase this, but I'm going to try to do the best I can. Has there been enough data out there on the P3? Because you guys both described it as a delivery method. Is there any, have we gotten enough data? Have we received enough data now to say that, hey, the asset classes and the life cycle costs and the return on investment are better than the traditional method? Has there been anyone following and tracking all this stuff on P3s to say, hey, it's 20, yes, we're seeing a 20% better return on investment, or a 20% better life cycle cost and maintenance reduction costs, those kind of things. Is there anything out there that substantiates the success of P3?
Yeah, no, you hit it on the head, actually, talking about, just the life cycle maintenance and the cost reduction, because a lot of times, you'll weigh, well, to build a P3, it costs X. To build the regular way, it costs X minus, because, they don't, take into account the long-term maintenance piece of it, right? And so,
right.
All the deferred maintenance, all the life cycle. And so, yeah, so typically, not always, but typically, especially on a big civil deal, the public sector will have someone do what we call like a value for money analysis. And what they'll do is they will weigh P3, delivering the project via P3 versus maybe some kind of another alternative project delivery, whether it's design build or some kind of other type of, non-design bid build. And then the regular way they would normally do it. So, design bid build, bond for it, and then do all of the analysis to figure out where does the public sector get the most value for its money. And part of that it typically does include an analysis of the long-term maintenance piece of it, right? And that's where typically the P3 not always wins, and so sometimes the P3 won't win. And that's where, where John said earlier, every P3 is a little different. Every P3 is a little different, right? Maybe you have a great in-house staff that does maintenance great. I mean, and then you're like, well, we don't need that piece of it. Then why are you doing P3? You have the greatest in-house maintenance custodial staff ever, then sure, then don't do P3, right? But that's not typically the case, right? And that doesn't really lead to life cycle anyway, right? And so, oftentimes if you do a value for money analysis, again, depending on the project, depending on the complexity of the build, depending on rates for sure, right? They'll do this analysis and they'll figure out based on that analysis, okay, the P3 may be more expensive in the long run, but over the course of X period, depending on the term of the project, I'm actually going to save money by doing it this way, so let's do a P3. So it doesn't always conclude that. It shouldn't, because if it always concludes P3, then that's wrong, right? It should conclude, whatever is the right answer, right? And so if it's always going to conclude P3, then that's probably they probably have the wrong lever set up there, right? But that is something that's typically done, and they'll use, like, to your specific point, data that they've collected over the course of time. So typically on this kind of deal, so whether it's a road deal or a building deal, they will figure out a way to analyze, well, that, would typically cost this much to maintain this road, et cetera, et cetera. But John, I don't know if you had any other thoughts.
Well, a couple really footnotes on Steve's points. The short answer is yes, people are doing these analyses all the time to tune those value for money analyses. And it's more like, if the value for money analysis works out that there is long-term value for the public sector in this environment, on this tenor of a relationship, then you should go that way. People study that all the time. It suffers from a complication of always being retrospective. And I hasten to add that your question could be rephrased by metaphors like, have we determined that getting married is better than having a long-term girlfriend? And the answer is it really kind of depends on the two people. And so
who's analyzing that, right? It depends who you ask. Right?
That's a fair point.
The divorce attorneys, of course, Steve.
No, that's exactly right. If you ask the divorce attorneys, then it's, they have an answer, right?
So exactly. So successful P3s measured in arrears as whether or not that value for money manifested is true, but there were risks. There's hurricanes, there's 2020, there's material price escalation. That throws it off. It's never, in my opinion, an indictment of the delivery model. It's a expression of the situation. So the flip side is the long-term maintenance advantages you get are great all the way until the short-term risk allocations are spread out over 30 years. Sometimes those risks create knock-on effects that are difficult. And that's the risk that you take, not unlike the relationships I was talking about before. Yeah. So we really do advocate for a different frame of mind. You are together sometimes 30, 40, 50 years, and you need to behave that way. And the interactions are structured that way. The dispute resolution process is structured that way, where it's not trying to create adversarial situations, because that is a guarantee of dooming the people.
Right. Good answer. Good answer. Thanks for that explanation, gentlemen. John, we have a little bit of time left. This one's specific to you, to make sure I appease and appeal my Arizona constituents. Is there anything that you could any light you can add onto the South Mountain project about, if you look back at your familiarity with the people that were involved in that one, of what went well here in Arizona on that one, or any feedback that you heard, or even if there were some problems?
No problems. I not only knew the people in Arizona that did that, I knew the lawyers that helped write that contract, and I knew the technical advisors that were involved in advising you all of that, and they are the best in the market, excluding Steve and myself, of course.
I was going to say, there's got to be a caveat there.
They did all the things that you're supposed to do. They knew what they were getting into. They had a very sensible assessment of who was going to be affected. They were cognizant of the impacts on the environment. They were responsive to the market. They were technically capable, and I have met many dedicated public servants in my life, and I am here to tell you that the public folks that were running that for Arizona DOT were trying to do the right thing for the citizens of the state. Wow. South Mountain is a really good example of a DBOM, no financing in that deal.
Yep.
But it spread risk over the life cycle of that project and paid for performance, which, as far as I have heard, mostly for lack of problems, it's functioning, which means they tuned it right. They got the right price. They got the thing built in for the thing, and I'm sure it's achieving its public ends. There's nothing bad about the South Mountain Freeway in terms of its reputation in the market.
Oh, thank you. I know when I first used it, it was a game changer to get from one side of town to the other. I mean, it was, when I say game changer, that's an understatement, and you hardly heard any negative publicity about it. So it's nice to hear you validate that.
Yeah, we should do more South Mountain freeways. In fact, I know of at least a couple states that have plucked that contract up and said, if this one worked, I want to understand why.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Steve.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, I would say, that's a good example of a project that was one thing, and the public sector, because it was going to have a financing at some point, and then they realized, what, it doesn't actually make sense. So let's keep all the design and all the things we've done thus far, and just pivot a little bit and do the right thing for the citizens of Arizona. And I think I echo everything John said. I mean, that's been a success and a very smart pivot. They realized that, they could pay for it and it'd be cheaper, et cetera, but they still kept a lot of the kind of core P3 things that we would normally have in there to make sure that the project did well. And to John's point, it's so great.
Gentlemen, how big is your fraternity? Like, how many specialists in P3 on the I call it the advocacy law side is really out there in the U.S.?
I don't know, Steve. What do you think? 25 or 30 of us?
Yeah, there's only one really good firm. That's us. But
is that, you mean the place that's hiring you?
Yeah.
After this podcast, everyone's going to be asking for your resume, so be careful.
Exactly. That's fine. No, yeah, I think John's right. It's a very small fraternity overall. Okay. We go to conferences, and the conferences are relatively big, but it's a lot of the same folks, whether it's legal advisors or financial advisors, and a lot of engineers, but even the engineers, same few companies we see, but it's a good fraternity. I will say it's a good fraternity. We all enjoy working together, and the partnership piece of it, even though it's kind of sometimes can be cheesy to think about it, we do try to make it that way, right? So even though the public and the private are certainly adverse from each other, at the end of the day, we know that they're going to have to live together for 30, 50, 75, 99 years sometimes, right? And so if if you can't figure it out, sometimes you need to get a divorce lawyer. So certainly, right? But ideally not. Ideally, you're going into it thinking that you can do it together for the full term. So, you do want to figure out a way to work well together.
I hasten to add, it's a fraternity and a sorority, just to be clear.
I should have been PC
That's
on
all
that
right.
one. Yeah.
It's not about for PC. Some of the most capable attorneys that have kicked my butt have been women, and that's great. So in this world where we're looking, that's a fantastic aspect of this, because it's really focused again on the performance. And if you know what you're doing, you know what you're doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well stated. Gentlemen, in the last few minutes here, I kind of open up the mic to both of you. What have I failed to ask you that you think is applicable and really an inner look into what you guys are doing or involved with, that the audience would, that we should know that we aren't prepared to ask you, either one of you?
One thing I will say is, even though we talk in the billions, I think this is something that can be used at the lug level, at the municipal level, for sure, at the county level, for sure. So to the extent anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out, because I think this is we always say it's a tool in the toolbox, and it really is, right? But it's a tool that goes unused, probably too often. And I think it can be used more at the municipal level. Just think about schools, buildings, whatever it might be.
Okay.
But my 2 cents would be, P3 is a family, again, of delivery options that really are best applied when reflected relative to the needs of the particular jurisdiction and the nature and the strengths of the people who are participating in it. It can be as simple as a design build, and it can be as complicated as Steve had said, a revenue risk type, delegated toll deal. And don't let the complication of the latter obscure the fact that there's a lot of space in between. So to fortify Steve's point about municipality, it can also be, you may have a project or you may have a problem to solve, and it doesn't have to involve parachuting in thousands of advisors giving you, 1,000-page contracts. It just requires a little bit of circumspection about what you're trying to do. And then there's usually a public-private lowercase type approach that is going to help you, rather than deferring to your existing delivery method when you feel like that's just not going to quite get there. So it's an array of things, and it requires some folks to have some trust and some interaction with both their private parties, if you're on the public side, and the public parties when you're on the private side, and the advisors who know to say, okay, this seems like a thing that would best be suited by this. Let's get moving. And that happens at all levels.
Nice. All right, final question, gentlemen. And if you could talk about it, great. If not, I understand you can keep it in generalizations, but what is the future of P3? But specifically in that, are there any things that are out for public knowledge right now, as far as, are there any P3 transformative projects on the horizon that are public information, and or, like I said, and or the future of P3 that you guys see coming?
Yeah, I would say that you're watching what I've been calling, perhaps dating me as a Gen Xer, the VHS Betamax problem of our time, which is
you're dating us, John.
That's all right. Somebody somewhere is Googling it, I'm sure.
Steve looks younger. You and I look a little bit more mature. So that's why it's
easier for Steve.
Hey, Steve, do you remember what an 8-track is?
I'm barely younger.
Oh, you wear it well, young man. All right, go ahead, John. Sorry.
Well, I mean, electric vehicles, there's been handed down from on high the need for us to figure out how to accommodate and move out fossil fuels, move into electric vehicles. Setting politics aside, that is a transformative infrastructure commitment that's coming from a governmental decision.
Okay.
So what those look like, how they're going to come together, whether or not they're financed, whether or not they're investable, how it is they're going to look, what those risks are going to be allocated. There's a P3 lurking in there. When I say with the widest possible thing, we're working on, several of the states have implemented their national EV implementation plans, which were mandated in the Infrastructure Act. They're out there now. So if you're looking for something to figure out which way it's going, you got 50 different states thinking about 50 different ways to solve problems on 50 different geographies with 50 different, as it were, fiscal strategies and devotion or lack of devotion to their particular delivery models. it's going to be a fruitful place. And I think once we solve the strategy that answers all of the different constituents' concerns, you're going to have something fantastic there. The only other one I'd offer is the efficiency in this world where people we are handling all the things for our community. I think that looking to experts to handle parts of them is also going to be another fertile place where a public-private partnership can handle, for example, potentially the power plant or the utility section for a microgrid, and that's going to feed into electronic vehicles and automated vehicles and all those other things, the CAVE program. Steve, I don't know if you had any other thoughts.
No, I mean, I think John's right. This is a perfect ending because the EV is a problem, and we want to be able to help solve some of those problems. So that is definitely going to be something that every state has to deal with. So.
Well, gentlemen, I can't thank you enough for joining. Whatever time we used up, an hour, it feels like it went by in 2 seconds. So if I may, John Smolen and Steve Park, both with Ballard Spahr, if anyone's interested in looking more into P3s, I'm sure they would. I'm not saying they're going to respond immediately, but they responded to me, and I just, I was a stalker and kind of track them down. So I'm sure they'd be more than happy to either answer your questions or put you in touch with other people in your community that is part of their sorority and fraternity. And just thanks again, gentlemen. Appreciate you being on.
You've been listening to the Mac and Blue Show, brought to you by Blue Wave General Contracting. Be sure to subscribe to the Mac and Blue podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Follow JJ Levinsky on LinkedIn and Instagram. Tune in every Monday